They say the desert never forgets. It holds onto pain the way wind clings to a canyon's edge, silent, invisible, constant. Long after the gunshots fade and the blood dries into dust, the land remembers. And if you listen, out near Dead Raven Bluff, when the stars come down close, you might still hear the story of the woman who lost everything, and the rider who came with no name and no voice, only justice in his shadow. Eleanor Bell wasn't born to the frontier, but it had shaped her all the same. She was once a teacher in a small eastern town, wearing gloves and reading Emerson aloud to sleepy farm children. But love took her westward, love, and a man named Jacob Bell, who bought a square of wild land and promised her they'd build something no wind could tear down. Jacob had been dead 2 years. The sickness came one bitter January and left her a widow before the snow thawed. But Eleanor stayed. She kept the cabin, taught children from the nearby ranches their letters and their hymns. She tended her garden and mended what could be mended. What couldn't be, she buried under the cottonwood tree behind the house. It happened in spring, when the sky was the color of cooled iron and the wind carried the scent of juniper and promise. She just finished a morning lesson, the children gone home, when the sound of hooves broke the calm. 3 riders came, their dust trailing like smoke, and with them rode the scent of whiskey, gunpowder, and rot. The Blackstone gang didn't ask for anything. They didn't demand gold or food. They laughed as they broke her door. Cain Blackstone, tall and lean as a fence post, found her hiding behind the stove and dragged her out by the hair. She screamed once. After that, her voice wouldn't come. Not when they shattered her dishes. Not when they set the books aflame. Not when they torched the cabin and left it howling in orange light. She walked to town barefoot, clothes torn, her throat raw from sobs that made no sound. Smoke still clung to her, like a second skin. Her boots were gone, taken by one of them as a joke. Stillwater Creek wasn't a large place. A saloon, a church, a general store, and a sheriff's office, with a crooked star nailed to the door. Folks saw her coming. They watched from porches, hands frozen mid-lift with tin cups or tobacco rolls. One woman whispered a prayer and stepped inside. Eleanor collapsed outside the church, eyes vacant, lips unmoving. When the preacher came, he crouched near, touched her shoulder, and offered water. She didn't drink. She didn't look up. Sheriff Mortensen arrived a while later, hat in hand. He was a thick man with a thinning mustache and a gut full of fear. He asked questions she couldn't answer. Then, realizing no words were coming, he cleared his throat and stood. "You know who did this?" He asked no one in particular. "Blackstone, I reckon. Been sniffing around the ridges again." Someone behind him muttered, "Cain's boys don't leave witnesses. That's a warning." "She's lucky she's still breathing," the sheriff said. "Nothing else to do but move on." And just like that, Eleanor Bell became a ghost in daylight. She slept behind the church for 2 nights, silent and still. The preacher gave her bread. No one else dared get close. The town had already decided she'd been marked. By the 3rd day, even the preacher looked uneasy. "She needs to leave," he told Sheriff Mortensen. "Her presence invites danger." Mortensen nodded, chewing his lip. "Maybe she heads east. Got cousins there, maybe?" She had no cousins. She had no one. Eleanor sat by the church bell, staring into the distance, where the plain stretched empty and yellow beneath a sky too big for mercy. Her hands trembled when she tried to eat. Her throat still burned. She hadn't spoken a word since the fire. Then, on the 4th morning, before the sun had yet burned off the dew, a horse came down the road from the west. He wasn't much to look at, that rider. Dusty lean, with a rifle slung low and a long coat stained from wind and miles. His hat shaded a face no one quite saw clearly, and he didn't speak when he passed the saloon, didn't tie his horse near the church, didn't pause at the sheriff's office. He rode slow, straight up to where Eleanor sat. The town held its breath. She looked up, the first time her eyes had met anything other than dirt or sky since the cabin fell. He dismounted in silence, boots stirring the dust. Then, without a word, he knelt beside her. His hand, rough, calloused, scarred, reached out. She didn't flinch. They stayed like that, the 2 of them, for a long while. She, with ashes still in her hair. He, unmoving as a rock. Then, slowly, she lifted her own hand and placed it in his. There was no lightning, no music, only silence. But in that silence, something ancient passed between them. When they rode out of town together that afternoon, no one stopped them. Sheriff Mortensen watched from his window and spat into a tin. "Best be gone," he muttered. "Ain't nothing but trouble comin' from that." The preacher folded his hands and whispered another prayer. No one knew the man's name. No one ever asked. All they knew was that a woman who'd lost everything had taken the hand of a stranger who asked nothing. And somehow, the land around Stillwater felt a little less quiet, like the desert had stirred in its sleep. The wind that night carried no screams, only the fading sound of hooves heading west. The stranger didn't speak, not once. Eleanor followed him because something in her had cracked, and he seemed carved from the same quiet stone. They rode along dry riverbeds and between canyon walls scorched red by time. He didn't look back to see as she followed, and she never asked where they were going. By nightfall, they reached a plateau fringed with pinyon pines and juniper brush. There, in a fold of the land invisible from any trail, sat a weather-worn canvas tent and a fire pit ringed with ancient stones. His horse knew the place and stopped without command. He handed Eleanor a blanket and nodded once to a flat stone where she could sit. Then, without a word, he started the fire, slow and methodical, like everything else he did. She watched him. His movements were deliberate, quiet, not cautious, but controlled. He had the look of someone who traveled too long, without expecting kindness. His eyes, when they caught the firelight, were the color of scorched earth. She didn't ask his name. She hadn't found her voice anyway. The days passed. He never touched her, never asked for thanks. He fed her jerky, boiled bitter coffee, and once, a roasted jackrabbit he skinned and cleaned with a knife that gleamed like a sliver of moonlight. He slept light and rose early, gone before the horizon blushed pink. Eleanor gathered water, learned to set snares, even helped him fix a broken saddle strap with sinew he'd carved from deer hide. With each task he showed her, not with words, but by doing, slowly enough she could mimic him. Her hands grew calloused, her shoulders stronger. One afternoon, while oiling his rifle, he paused and gestured for her to take it. It was a long-barreled Winchester with a worn grip. She held it awkwardly at first, unsure. He stood beside her, patient. He pointed at a rock down the hill, then tapped the trigger. She missed badly. Instead of correcting her, he reloaded, nodded again. She squared her shoulders, took a breath, fired. The rock chipped. He said nothing, but his eyes met hers, and something there, brief and flickering, felt like approval. Each evening, she found herself staring at the fire after he turned in. Memories clawed at the edges of sleep. The flames, the laughter of the Blackstone men, Kane's hand dragging her across broken floorboards. But in the stillness of the camp, beneath the stars and above the blood-soaked plains, she found herself holding back less. Her hands stopped trembling. Her eyes scanned the trees instead of the sky. And then one morning, she carved a word into the stock of the rifle, justice. She didn't show it to him. He saw it anyway. That night, he handed her a revolver, smaller, silver-plated, with a pearl grip. It fit her hand like it had waited there all her life. She didn't cry. She hadn't since the fire. But something shifted behind her ribs, something closer to breath than pain. Stillwater Creek was 4 days behind them when a boy on a piebald horse found their camp. He was wiry, maybe 10, clothes 2 sizes too large. He rode fast and reckless, eyes wide with something between awe and desperation. "Y'all Eleanor Bell?" he asked, panting. "I seen you ride out with a quiet man. Folks said you was gone, but I found you." "I did." She nodded, stepping from the trees. The boy looked at the stranger, but got no answer. "Sheriff says Kane Blackstone's coming back through Stillwater. Claims he's looking for someone. Talk is, he means to burn more than a cabin this time." Eleanor didn't blink. "He's riding with 5 men," the boy added, quieter now. "Big ones. One of 'em got a silver tooth." The rider tilted his head slightly, just enough to meet Eleanor's eyes. She turned to the fire pit, kicked dirt over the coals. Her voice still hadn't returned, but her body spoke for her. They were leaving. The boy offered directions to a place called Crimson Hollow, a narrow gorge south of the ridge, with only 2 ways in and 1 way out. He'd seen Blackstone's men camped near there once, careless and drunk. She placed a hand on his shoulder. It was the closest she could come to thanks. That night, they rode under a moon thin as a scythe, through scrub and sage, avoiding trails. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. He rode ahead, his silhouette framed by pale stars and wind-carved stone. She followed with the rifle across her back, the revolver at her side, and a new silence inside her, not the empty kind, but the waiting kind. Somewhere out there, Cain Blackstone was sharpening his cruelty. But Eleanor Bell no longer feared the sound of fire. She carried it with her now. Crimson Hollow was narrow and cruel, 2 walls of jagged red rock pressing and like a clenched jaw, with a dry stream bed running crooked down its spine. The sun barely touched the floor of the gorge by mid-morning, and at night, the chill came fast, sinking through leather and bone. It was the kind of place men didn't linger unless they had business best left buried. The silent rider dismounted first. He walked the length of the canyon's western edge, running a hand along the stone as if listening to it. Eleanor stayed by the horses, watching his movements with growing clarity. He wasn't scouting. He was preparing. He'd been here before. She followed when he gestured. He knelt near a rise of boulders and began clearing small patches of brush, revealing lines of sight and natural choke points. The canyon, with all its twisted passes and blind turns, was a trap waiting for a patient hand. By dusk, they had set it. He dug shallow pits and lined them with broken stone. Eleanor placed the iron caltrops he handed her like a ritual, spacing them near the canyon mouth. He drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, no words, only marks and arrows, and she understood them all. Then came the rifle. He climbed a crag on the south face, laid his weapon across a flat stone, and tested angles until he was satisfied. She stayed below, near the place where Blackstone's men would enter, revolver holstered at her hip, heart steady. When night fell, they waited in silence. The canyon held its breath. They came just before dawn, 6 riders, Cain at the head, his long coat flapping like a shadow at war with the wind. The others followed with easy arrogance, unaware that the rocks watched them. Cain pulled up first, scanning the narrow path ahead. His horse snorted, uneasy. Cain stroked its neck and muttered something low. Then he dismounted. Eleanor saw him clearly from her perch, behind a slab of sandstone. He looked just as she remembered, tall, wild-bearded, and smiling like he always knew something others didn't. The silver-handled pistol on his belt glinted in the morning gray. 2 of his men moved ahead, rifles slung. One passed the first caltrops, stumbled, cursed. A shot cracked, sharp and final. The man dropped. His scream was short. Panic bloomed. Another turned, firing blindly toward the ridge. The second shot came quick, precise. Now they knew. Cain shouted, grabbing the reins of his horse and ducking behind a boulder. Up top, he roared. They've got high ground. Eleanor stepped into the open. She didn't raise her gun yet. She wanted him to see her. Cain's eyes widened. Well, look at that, he said, laughing, even as his men scattered for cover. The little widow found a backbone. He moved fast, too fast for a man who'd spent his life drunk on his own legend. His pistol came up, but her shot came first. His hat flew from his head. A warning. He dove behind a rock. 2 more shots echoed from above, his men falling, scrambling, falling again. Dust clouded the air. The gorge screamed with ricochets and horse curses. Eleanor moved low, crossed the dry stream bed, and took cover near a cluster of boulders. She could feel her heartbeat in her teeth, but her hands didn't shake. Not anymore. Cain's voice rose through the canyon. You don't have the stomach, Ellie Bell. You can burn, but you can't kill. She answered with her revolver. 3 shots in quick succession that shattered the rock inches from his head. Then the silence came back, thick and suffocating. Only 3 of Blackstone's men remained now. One tried to mount a horse, only to be thrown by a bullet through the saddle horn. Another crawled behind a crevice and stayed there, whimpering. Cain fired again, wild, desperate. Eleanor moved in, slow and steady, circling him. When the last shot came from the ridge, the canyon grew quiet. The final man fell face down in the gravel. Cain rose, hands open, empty. "Well," he said, wiping blood from his temple, "you brought a ghost with a rifle. Clever girl." She didn't answer. He smiled wide and slow. "Go ahead then. Be the widow with a vengeance. Finish the story." But she didn't move. Behind him, the silent rider appeared. He stepped from the shadows like a wraith, rifle slung. He hadn't spoken once, not even now. But his presence was louder than thunder. Cain turned, startled, reaching for a hidden blade. The rider was faster. One shot. Cain Blackstone collapsed to his knees, blood blooming dark against the dust. He looked up at Eleanor, eyes stunned. You're nothing." She holstered her weapon. "I was," she whispered, her voice, ragged and raw, carried through the canyon like prophecy. Cain fell face first, silent at last. The rider turned away. Eleanor watched him walk past the bodies, without pause. No glory, no triumph. Just a job done. Justice served. She stood alone in Crimson Hollow, breathing the same air she once thought she'd never taste again. And above her, the sky was turning gold. By midday, the canyon was quiet again, not with the silence of fear, but the stillness that follows when something heavy has finally settled into the earth. The bodies were buried shallow, rocks piled in uneven mounds, nameless and unmarked. Cain's grave lay separate, not out of honor, but distance. Eleanor had insisted on that much. The rider said nothing as they worked. He packed his rifle with the same care he showed on the first day. She followed him into the brush. When she finished tying the last stone atop the graves, he was already saddling the horses. Still, she lingered. The dust from their boots didn't rise as high anymore. The wind that once cut her skin now carried warmth. Her hands, once blistered and bruised, bore the confidence of someone who had wrestled her past into submission and come out whole. She turned to him as he tightened the last strap. "You'll ride on," she said. He paused. "I can see it in you," she added. "You don't belong to anyone, or any place." His eyes met hers, calm and unreadable. "You saved me," she said, voice steady now. "But I won't follow this time." A nod. Just that. Then he mounted, reins loose in his hands. The horse turned slowly, hooves crunching over loose gravel, and began the climb out of Crimson Hollow. She watched him go until he vanished into the stone's embrace. No dust trail behind him, no sound. She never learned his name. Word traveled faster than horses in those days, and by the time Eleanor returned to Stillwater, the town buzzed with fragments of her tale. They said she'd come back with a fire in her eyes and a stranger at her back. They said Cain Blackstone and his gang were found dead in a canyon carved by God's own fury. They said a woman had walked through the valley of death and come out the other side without blinking. Eleanor didn't speak much of it. What could she say that would be understood? That vengeance didn't fill the emptiness it promised? That peace wasn't loud or triumphant, but quiet, like the moment before dawn? She rebuilt her cabin, not in the same spot, but near a ridge where the wind carried birdsong and the soil ran richer. The townsfolk offered help, and she took it, sparingly. She lived simply, tools on the wall, a horse in the stable, and the silver-handled revolver always within reach. Sometimes, travelers came asking about the man with no name. A marshal once, a bounty hunter twice. She told them the truth. She didn't know who he was. She only knew what he wasn't. He wasn't one of Cain's, and he wasn't someone to chase. They always left unsatisfied. Years passed. The canyon weathered more storms. Stillwater grew, new faces, new stores, new gossip. But the story remained, told in hushed tones by firelight or over whiskey at the saloon. It morphed and twisted, as stories do. Some said the rider was a ghost, the last soul of a massacred ranger company. Others believed he was a federal man gone rogue, cleaning up the frontier in his own silent way. A few swore he was death himself, given a second chance to walk beside the living, judging one soul at a time. And always, they spoke of the woman, the widow who had nothing left but grit in her heart and justice in her blood, the one who didn't flinch when the devil called her name, who buried her fear beneath a stone and walked out of hell alone. Children grew up hearing her tale. They called her Eleanor Bell, but more often, they just said the widow. And some nights, when the wind blew hard across the plains and the sky split with thunder, folks swore they saw a rider moving along the ridge. No camp, no fire, just a silhouette against lightning, quiet as breath, watching, waiting. Eleanor never confirmed it. She grew older. Lines etched themselves into her skin like the scars on old leather, but her eyes stayed sharp, and her aim sharper. She taught a few to shoot, some to ride. She never remarried, though a kind blacksmith once asked. On the first frost of her 62nd year, she rode out alone toward Crimson Hollow. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, just left a note on her kitchen table. I owe him a visit. She never came back. Some believe she found him again, wherever he wandered. Some think she chose to fade where her story began, swallowed by red stone and soft dirt. Either way, the legend lived on, of the silent rider, and the woman who learned silence could roar louder than gunfire. And in that part of the country, if you pass a lone cabin standing proud against the wind, you might see a rifle above the mantel, a pearl-handled revolver on the table, and boot prints in the dust leading to the door. They say the widow still walks among the wild, and they say justice, once called, never forgets the name of those who burned, nor the hands that reached into the fire.